Hi guys, everyone who's joining. I represent the PR Club and we're holding the Managing Diverse Viewpoints webinar. So we're excited to have everyone join and hopefully have a really good discussion today. I wanted to introduce you guys to our fantastic panel today. We have Angela Hayes, she's the SVP of Diversity and Inclusion over at Brodeur Partners. We have Tori Poole, she's the Vice President and Head of DEI at Inkhouse. And we have Dr. Terrell Lamont Strayhorn. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He's the founder and CEO of Do Good Work Educational Consulting and former provost of Virginia Union University. So we have a good panel here. All these guys are really, really knowledgeable. So I'm excited to kick us off. So first things first, I'd love if you guys could kind of just tell us a little bit about your background. How did you get involved? How are you doing this? Kind of, where did you come from?
Great. And so Alice, Caitlin, I'll get started. Again, my name is Angela Hayes. I'm the Senior Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion for Brodeur Partners. I entered diversity and equity and inclusion work through a previous career in the nonprofit sector and found that one of the biggest opportunities across our culture is for organizations to be more empowered to build authentic relationships across different community groups. And so that became a sort of a lifelong passion and has put me on this career path. And Tori, do you want to jump in next?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. As Caitlin mentioned, my name is Tori Poole. I work as a vice president at Inkhouse. We're a mid-sized PR firm with locations, physical offices in New York and Boston and Seattle and San Francisco. We're a full service public relations agency. In there, I serve in a dual role where I'm the vice president over some of our accounts, mostly in the consumer sector. And then I'm also the VP of DE&I. And for me, the work in DE&I is so important. I took a little pause from my career and was pregnant in 2020 when some of the activities were happening with the George Floyd murder in May. And as a biracial woman, I felt completely hopeless and overwhelmed by that. And I was also pregnant with a son who was also going to be entering the world as a mixed race person. And it was sort of like at that moment, I thought there has to be something that I can use some of my skill sets eventually to make some sort of impact. So I would say that was my first inspiration. I didn't know what it was that I would do, but I just knew that this could not be a world in which my son lives in. This cannot happen. So I would say it's the mama bear in me that sort of led me to this work. And so now I'm helping to run internally our DE&I efforts, and then also from an external multicultural perspective for our clients.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And Tori, you almost created the perfect segue for Dr. Strayhorn, who I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, but I know the depth of your history around culture and education and how tied social justice and how timely a moment in history for us it was with the murder of George Floyd. So Dr. Strayhorn, could you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your background in education as it relates to influencing culture?
Absolutely. And thanks, Angela. And feel free, everyone, to call me Terrell. But yes, I'm Terrell Strayhorn, and it was mentioned, formerly served as the Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs and the Director of the Center for the Study of HBCUs at Virginia Union University. Before that, I served in academic administration at Lemoyne-Owen College and on the faculty at Ohio State and University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And so this is like hot off the press, not even published on my own social media yet, but come this fall, I'll be a professor at Illinois State University. And really getting back to exactly what this, this question is really pointed to, and that is I came into this work certainly, as an African-American male living in the South, growing up in the South, and realizing that many of these experiences I had growing up and in college, graduate school, even as a faculty member at a predominantly white institution, were shaped by the institution or organization's readiness to embrace diversity, to create equity, and to foster true inclusion. So as a faculty member, I conducted research on DEI and bumped into my life's work on sense of belonging and the role that it plays in fostering culture and connections that really can be meaningful for the bottom line at organizations and corporations, but also for those big, large learning outcomes that we have in educational institutions. So I've written, going to keep writing, studying, researching, training students to do this work. But as I moved from just the teaching and research into administration, I also understood as a provost that the success of my division, that is in recruiting talented faculty, retaining them, and making sure that they are free to work with my students in classrooms in ways that will prepare them for their future, depended on us fostering a campus climate that was that celebrated and recognized diversity, that we dealt with issues of equity. I know we're going to get to this, but I mean equity in its largest forms, not just making sure that we have representational diversity on the faculty, but that people are paid in equitable ways and that we're fostering inclusion, their voices feel heard. And so that's my on-ramp into this conversation. Looking forward to the discussion.
That's wonderful. Thank you guys so much for sharing your background and expertise. I really appreciate it. Before we kick off to a few questions, I just wanted to let the participants know that if you have a question or you have a topic you want to discuss, feel free to drop it in the Q&A or the chat feature, and I'll make sure that we ask that towards the end. So the first question I think is pretty simple. Why do you think companies and organizations care about DEI now? Clearly, there's been more conversations about this. What's changed? Why is this important now?
Dr. Strayhorn, you want to take that one first?
I'll tackle
Terrell.
it. Thank you. I thought about this question a little bit and thought I might start this way. First, I would, in fairness to those companies and organizations that are out there and have been committed to DEI and DEIB work, B for me stands for belonging. I would just acknowledge that I don't know that every organization is now paying attention to it. I think there are some organizations out there that have been concerned with issues of climate and workplace environment and representational diversity. I think what is happening actually is that there is certainly a greater awareness in society to organizations that are committing more than just lip service, but resources, energy, plans, and programming to this work. So more than organizations sort of getting on the bandwagon, I think it's that society is now realizing, for many of the reasons we've already talked about, Tori's point to that transformative moment for society, the shameful public killing of George Floyd was one of those moments where people realized we're in the middle of this pandemic. We were forced to disconnect from one another and told, perhaps rightfully so, that our safety depended on us staying apart, physically distancing, masking up. And then this thing happened in society that we all watched, and it called questions to our collective consciousness, and questions that we have kicked around for generations, like, what's the value of one's life? And are all lives created equal and celebrated and respected in the same way? What is my social responsibility to your commonwealth and well-being? And so out of this moment, we realize, oh my gosh, we got to do something. And we expect organizations to be deliberate and intentional, proactive, anti-racist. And we have the language now because of, I would argue shout out to all of my scholar friends in the virtual audience. I think the scholarship, the media, so, the research, the writing, the media attention to it has given us a lexicon, a word for talking about these subjects in ways that we can say, hey, what is your organization doing? What has it done to foster DEI? No longer is it acceptable. It probably wasn't ever, but we as a society will no longer accept that, hey, these are complicated issues. I don't really know what else I can do. There's just way too much knowledge out there now about what works, what doesn't work, what can be properly tried. And I think because of the attention to these social issues matched with the availability and accessibility of information about what one can do, we find now this sort of heightened awareness to what corporations and businesses are doing to foster DEI work that I think can be really exciting.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I would also add, I agree, if we're looking at it from maybe like a bubbling over point of May 2020, I mean, for purposes of this context, I think a couple other things have been in play. Of course, the pandemic did totally isolate people, but it also brought people in where they had nothing else to do except be on their media, to be communicating with people, to read, to do research, to pause. I think that was really helpful, as Terrell has mentioned, to give, typically or historically disproportioned people, which are people of a minority race, gender, culture, the tools and the community and the confidence and the know-how to put their foot down. I think that has really been powerful and super impactful. We work in the media. I will say that media have been really at a driving force. I mean, something that I think we'll touch on a lot, and how DE&I can impact, and what we're seeing from a PR perspective is, we're hearing from media, from journalists, from organizers of conferences, that they no longer want a panel to just be of old white men. They're like, if you have a spokesperson, they better be racially diverse. They better have a female perspective. It's like no longer, they're calling people out, which is, I think, really, we're seeing it is driving our spokespeople, our companies that we're working with, to evaluate what is going on within their corporation, and their employees are demanding it. I will also say that I think the work from home has also created this interesting culture in a workplace where work is no longer just work. I mean, I'm sitting at my dining room table. I have photos of my husband and my son behind me. I mean, this is like, you're in my house. That's where we're at now. So the workplace is no longer a place where you just like go in and clock out. We're hearing it over and over again that, the people who are managing people need to not be just taking into consideration their skills, but also the like psychological safety that they're providing for their teams. Like, it's just, we're just in an entirely different world. And I think companies and organizations are starting to, there have been some who have realized it, and those who haven't sort of jumped on the bandwagon, I think, are there. Now it's just, their DE&I efforts be executed effectively and authentically? And is this going to be something that just stops next year? Or is this something that people are going to continue to see when the pressure isn't there? And then one other thing I'll say too, that I'm seeing, hearing, understanding, especially as I'm having conversations like, in our workforce, PR in our industry, specifically in a PR agency, skews really young. So we're talking to Gen Zers, and they are not going to put up with some of the things that have historically happened in the workplace culture. I mean, we're talking to candidates, and one of their first questions is, what are your DE&I efforts that are happening within your organization? I think the sort of activism we're seeing from that group of individuals who are coming up is absolutely incredible and outstanding. They are confident and empowered, and they have the knowledge, they have the tools, they have the passion. I think they're also going to set like a really nice tone to continue DE&I work beyond just one moment in time.
Yeah, Tori, I think you raise a really good point, in that not only does that happen internally, is that level of accountability happening as those generations migrate into the workplace, but it also happens from a consumer perspective. When you ask the question, why are companies paying attention now? I believe that the altruistic reasons are important and help drive them, but the bottom line is, it's also impacting the bottom line. you are on full display when there's some sort of national crisis related to diversity or equity or inclusion or belonging, and companies get caught without a position, not knowing what to say. And so I think that that's forced, and knowing that Gen Z, Centennials are increasingly diverse populations, period, and their expectations and demands around diversity and equity and inclusion and belonging and justice are different from Gen X and from boomers. It has put, the traditional company infrastructure in a position where I believe in this year of accountability, it's not going away. It's not something that is a one and done or will eventually fade off. I think that the intensity around demands for companies will only intensify, and it's in their best interest to take it seriously.
That's wonderful. So what does diversity, equity, inclusion mean to you all, both professionally and personally?
Well, I touched a little bit on it for me personally. I mean, I think I don't think this work just needs to be done by people who identify as in a diverse population, but it does help. I would say this work is really personal. And I find that when I'm talking a lot with those in our community, in our workforce, who identify, whether in a BIPOC community, they identify as LGBTQA+, this is personal. This is something that means something to people beyond just something transactional. There's a lot of, all humans. I find this work in DE&I is at the most simple level around people and everybody. I think Terrell said it best, the belonging, I think, is so important. It's being seen, valued, and heard. That is how I take it at the simplest form, because I do find that this topic can be really heavy and tough for people. There's a lot of avoidance, especially from white people, understandably, being nervous about making a mistake, about being perceived as racist, as, there's a lot. And so I like to simplify it to people to encourage them to understand that, if you have the best intentions and you understand that at a human basic level, every human, doesn't matter who you are, wants to be seen, valued, and heard, right? Like, that's what we're here to do. And because of something outside of your individual control, that hasn't always been the case. So what can we do to help create an equal playing field for others? And I like to explain it, people who are diverse or who have been considered or bucketed into a minority category their whole life are disproportionate people, feel it more than others. It just is what it is. They need to be seen, valued, and heard more. If everybody is starting here, and people who, are diverse in a minority capacity are here, what we're trying to do is create equity. So everybody can be here maybe, right? And I find by simplifying it and tying things back to like human elements and the personal aspect of it, and not that anyone is trying to single out one person for being evil, is just a really great way for everyone to understand it. I also like to lead from like a professional standpoint, something I like to call empathetic leadership, which I think isn't always considered a lot in corporations and in organizations, which it's, again, I mentioned before, less about managing people and providing leadership based on a skill set, but it's offering empathetic leadership to meet people where they are. Like, every person has a different experience. And I feel like with the DE&I work, we're not just talking about diversity, we're talking about people who have different backgrounds, different life experiences, They might have different ways of communicating, different ways of talking, different cultures they've been introduced to. Like not everybody is coming from the same position. And so how can you help people feel like their individual personality, person who they are, belongs in an environment? It's driven by, I feel like, empathetic leadership, which is just truly learning about somebody, meeting somebody, understanding somebody. I like to think of it too as, if you're to go out and to meet a new friend, like, are you going to start to ask them questions about themselves? Like, how do you form relationships with people? Do you go out and you just assume every single person is going to want to talk about one specific thing you want to talk about? Or are you going to go and try to meet people where they are? It's the same thing when we talk about managing diverse populations. It's the same thing when we're talking about working in a climate where there are going to be people who do not look like you, who do not have the same shared lived experiences as you. It's truly just getting to know somebody. It's really funny because from a personal level, I feel so personally passionate about this. And I try to think, other than myself, identifying as half African-American and half white. My mother is white. My father is Black. I grew up with both of my parents in my house. They've been married for 40 years. I have a very interesting, a perception of things. I've heard every single thing. I've had people say every single thing to me. But I don't even go after, I don't even approach this work from my own personal reasons. I approach it from like my husband's story, who he also grew up in the South as a Black man. And he tells me stories that would make your jaw drop on the floor, that are unacceptable, that any human should ever have had to even hear some of the things he's heard. I like to talk to my dad, who grew up in a housing project, who was dropped off in college with one suitcase. He thought he grew up kind of wealthy, and then he made it to Bowdoin College up in Maine. And he's like, wow, we're poor. And I grew up in a housing project. This is the first time I've ever understood this. And he's now a CFO of a company and first person out of any person in his family to go to college. And I think about him and I think of all the opportunities he's created for himself. And that inspires my work. So I always encourage people, like, who are the 5 people in your phone that you talk to the most, that you text, you go on Instagram and look at, to call? Do they look like you? Do they talk like you? Do they went to the same college as you? Did they grow up in a similar neighborhood? If the answer is yes, you're self-segregating, and why don't you go meet some new friends? And then I promise you this work will be so natural to you, because when the people you love have faced some of the things that I know all of us know, then you're passionate about figuring out a way that everyone feels like they could belong somewhere and feel included. It's as simple as that.
Dr. Strayhorn, you want to jump in?
Always happy to. I'm back to Strayhorn again. Okay. So yeah, I acknowledge and agree with so much of what Tori shared, that the question of what does DEI mean to me on a personal and a professional level. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are related, but not the same. So I think that is an important part of the meaning that I make of them, is that when I think about diversity personally and professionally, I'm often thinking about structural diversity, which refers more to the presence of and the complexity, the heterogeneity of groups, and also the frequency with which individuals from certain groups show up in an organization. I think as a, personally, it's important for me as I navigate the world, that I see people who look like me showing up in spaces that I either I populate, I'm a member of, or that maybe I aspire to one day be part of. But I think professionally, structural diversity is useful to me, because as a manager, as a leader, I can count that. I can, collect data and track and look at and disaggregate, you know, places where I've worked previously in leadership, I have been very aware and mindful of people of color, women of color, LGBTQIA folks, and where they show up on my team. And where they're not present, that I'm being intentional to work with my team to build on ramps into those spaces. So structural diversity for me is one element of diversity. The other one, though, is more around like interactional diversity. It's not that we're just all present, but that we engage one another and we exchange ideas. And I, you know, as a leader, I think it is important. I'm doing this because that's me talking, right? But I think it's important that we communicate as leaders the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion, not just lip service, but, you know, I am thoughtful about building teams that are diverse because I believe that the best ideas come out of that. So how do I apply this in practice? You know, for instance, and you know, my previous institution can probably, if they're watching or if they're listening, they will tell you this. Like when it came time to recruit faculty, a faculty member in criminal justice, I don't want only people in criminal justice on that committee. I want people in education, people in theology. I want some staff members who are not faculty. At Virginia Union, for faculty hiring committees now, there's a student rep on a voting student rep on every committee. That's not just to get likes and tweets on social media to do something cool and different. It's because fundamentally, I mean, listen, these faculty will go in classrooms and teach students. Students' opinions matter. How better to signal to people that your voice matters, your opinion matters, than to put them on the committee that hires the person. And unlike some other institutions, no slap to them, just, you know, we can model after each other, but, you know, I didn't make them non-voting members of the committee. The voice of the student counts. So I think that interactional diversity is important, that we're creating moments where people come together with different mindsets, different life histories to engage one another. They come up with creative solutions. But I'll close by saying that the equity piece for me is also really important. That is that we realize we are all here. And I love this because it's like 4 symmetrical boxes on my screen. But listen, no matter how orderly Zoom makes us, our lives are not, you know, symmetrical. Our paths to this moment are not the same. And that's not just true for the 4 of us on this panel and then the 30+ folks in the room, those who will watch the recording later. It's true for all of us. And so in acknowledging that and then taking action to create the supports, the scaffolds, the assistance that all of us need in order to live our best lives, to be productive in workplaces, to achieve our educational dreams is so critically important. I always say nowadays, first of all, everyone needs assistance. Everybody needs help. It's not just low income, no income, first generation, LGBTQIA, folks who live with disabilities. Everyone needs some help and assistance in life. It's just a difference of what kind of help and the amount of help that we need at what point in time. And so equity is coming into this moment around DEI, realizing because these corporations, businesses, colleges and universities, schools were set up at a time. I just finished a book chapter the other day talking about men's colleges and thinking about the fact that higher education in this country kicked off with the founding of Harvard College, now university, in 1636. 1636. That much of higher education, my discipline and field, is modeled after what Harvard did, but Harvard was founded in 1636 in this country when the country was not thinking about me, wasn't thinking about people of color, wasn't thinking about women, it wasn't thinking about people living with disabilities, it wasn't even thinking about military veterans. And so we adopt this model from this highly elite, exclusive institution doing good work, but founded for the sons of wealthy white folk, for 2 occupations, to go into politics or religion. And look at how many more jobs there are now, destinations for people, but the model of higher education is based on something that was not built for the people, for the masses of people who are in the system now. So equity is admitting that, not being embarrassed, not feeling like we're pointing fingers and saying people are bad and that this institution versus this institution, but recognizing because of that, people need support to be successful in institutions that were not created for them. And that support ranges from financial aid to academic advising to intrusive supports to clubs and organizations to supplemental instruction, study abroad. I mean, the list goes on. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that. And I think that that's a perfect segue into what our responsibility, many of the people on this call, being public relations practitioners, our responsibility as PR practitioners in raising that conversation with our clients, because it's not natural for many leaders within companies to think inclusively. I mean, it's just not. And as public relations professionals, I think that we all have, especially as we enter this era where there's so many different generations within the workforce. I know Brodeur Partners just recently did some research that discovered, that highlighted how differently Gen X and boomers and millennials and Gen Z see particular issues, and we're all in the workplace together, and all in a workplace that is not designed to navigate these complex social issues. I mean, your job may be making widgets, and part of making widgets is not necessarily talking about these complex social issues that your employees are dealing with on a regular basis. I know one of the pieces of research that the generation see the language around completely differently are things like critical race theory, the term critical race theory, how differently centennials and millennials see that term compared to Gen X and boomers, and how inflammatory it can be within the context of, of an environment where there are multiple generations in the same place. And I do believe that empathetic leadership is not only the responsibility of executive leaders, but of any PR professional that manages an account, that comes into contact with a professional, with a company, with the media, any PR professional that's representing the opinion of another group or helping to shape the opinion of another group has the responsibility to really understand empathetic leadership, to do like what Tori said, evaluate your own network and ask yourself the hard question, do I self-segregate? And be willing to explore that in yourself so that you can show up and provide the best counsel as you're trying to help other systems navigate managing, diverse viewpoints and diverse experiences and perspectives within the context of public relations.
Your comments, Angela, made me think of something, especially for the PR industry. And that is, as a leader and who has hired and recruited, but also as a person who writes about belonging in workplaces and learning what I'm learning from the Gen Zers and millennials. It's interesting. When my grandmother was alive, she was a public school teacher for like 55 years. And I remember she powerfully shaped my upbringing. And she would say to me things like, when you get a job, you want to keep that job and you just want to do whatever the man tells you. That's what my grandma would say, don't judge, safe space. But she would say, do whatever he says, because, you just want to get a good job. And that's a great lesson born out of her era, right? Where he was one of the first African-American women to teach in her predominantly white school system, be celebrated and recognized for, lots of awards throughout her career. But because of the fact that she was in that first wave, it shaped how she thinks about issues like loyalty And these are not terms people even talk about nowadays. And to loyal to an employer, that's reflects my grandmother's generation. Well, nowadays, this idea of like, people who, employees, prospective employees want to know, sure, what's my salary? What's my job? What's expected of me? But I'm finding and hearing lots of people who are saying things like they want to know what are the values of the organization? Because what they're looking for is values alignment, which is so critical. Like, maybe you're not going to give me the $5,000 extra that I want. Maybe I'm not going to get the office with the window. Maybe I won't have summers off, or maybe I will. But I got to know that, there are some things that we hold in common, values about work-life balance and the prioritization of personal matters and family, right? That the organization's viewpoint about, even what's currently happening with Ukraine, these very large global issues. And so I've been surprised because in these interviews, as I'm trying to finish up this project about this, I'm asking these prospective employees, like, how are you learning about the organization's values? And some of them, it's on the website, it's published, there are letters, memos from the CEO. Listen, for whoever needs to hear it, they're watching YouTube videos of the corporation. They're looking for your statement on George Floyd. They're looking for your statement on not just George Floyd, but anti-Asian hate and LGBTQIA rights and issues. And so if you're not already out there, or for the PR professionals who are thinking about this, you can help the bottom line of the organization. I know some people don't like when I talk like that because it's too business, but for me, we're all in businesses. You can help the bottom line. That is recruiting good talent, keeping good talent, retaining good talent when we are explicit, not just about the, assets that we hold as a company, but also that we are explicit about our vision, our mission, our core values, and most importantly, how we live those out. Like today, you can probably see I was intentional about what I would wear today. So this is a coffee shop that I support in Atlanta. Why do I support it? Not because I know the people, not because they're my friends, but when I went to Atlanta, I went to this coffee shop, I learned that they not only employ refugees, they take money, resources from the coffee shop to support the issues of refugees in this country. That's an admirable mission and vision. Coffee with the cause, as I say. So as one who hopes to own a coffee shop one day, it's important for me to know that this is what this organization is about. I learned it from some of the little cards that were on the table in the coffee shop. So again, PR plays an important role in communicating, but not just who the CEO is, but what they stand for.
Yeah.
And I'll say one thing too, that is so true. And for those who are in PR listening as well, like, we're hearing that all the time from candidates, like, what are your values? We see there's a lot with DE&I, but is it performative or is it real? Like, what are you really doing? Who really has a seat at the table? I think that was so great insight that Terrell said about, like, and that could be applied to our field as well, is, if you have diversity committees at your organization, like, don't just have them be the executives that are talking in a silo, but like invite somebody else who's a junior level member to have a seat at the table, to have representation across the board. I think that's super important. But another thing we're hearing, and this applies to an agency setting, are like, who are your clients and what do they care about? And what are they doing? So it's one thing if, okay, we're creating a great culture internally and we're all super inclusive and I feel safe at your organization working, but what are your clients doing? What standards are we holding them to? Like, if we're saying we're going to diversify our workforce, are we asking the clients in which we work with to do the same? Or are we just continuing to like push the same sort of narratives and help to bring awareness to the same people who are making decisions? And that's been like a really interesting conversation we've had internally at Inkhouse, in talking about, who we're bringing on to our roster. And like, our employees are not just looking for their work environment. As we know, in an agency setting, most interaction you have is with your client. So your organization could be amazing, but are the clients, is the work you're doing great? Does it give you like pause for concern? I call it. Are you getting a strange feeling? And what are you doing about it? Are you just immediately cutting ties? So it's not just about, at Inkhouse, I try with getting buy-in internally to like have a very simple mission, which is, because, you have executive level people who are thinking about everything, right? So, oh, we want to do this big, DE&I party. We want to do a pride party. Okay, well then are people who are heterosexual, are they going to feel left out? That's a question that people will ask. Like, we're putting, $5,000 into a pride party. Well, what are we doing for the other folks? So to sort of combat that, like, we come up with like a very simple mission at Inkhouse that everything can tie back to. Like, we're trying to create an environment where every single person feels seen, valued, and heard, and there is overall inclusion. Simple as that. Simple as that. So if the majority of the people who work for us in PR, it's women, which is insane, but we are the majority. So the minority group are men. So if your organization in a PR agency is mostly white women, then that is the majority. And therefore anybody who is not in that is considered the minority within your organization. Then on top of it, if most of your clients are white women who have CMO titles, who have director of PR titles in some of these companies, then that also is. So if we're talking about the Zoom box, which a lot of people who work for me say this all the time, like, the worst feeling in the world is to come on your Zoom call and you are the only person who even looks anything like yourself, right? It's a gut-wrenching feeling of feeling absolutely like you don't belong. It's a true slap in the face because you see it right in front of you. So if that's the case, like, what can you do to help those people who are not in the majority feel like they belong, they are seen, they're heard, they're valued? And so again, that starts with making changes in our organization, but then also making changes in who we are working with. And, if we're demanding it for ourselves, then we need to be demanding it for our clients as well.
And that's a great segue into the next question, which is all about clients. Obviously, companies are now propelled to speak up about these injustices and societal issues going on. So from your perspective, where are companies missing the mark when it comes to managing these different perspectives? And what are some suggestions that you may have for how they can create synergy across different audience groups? Because all companies are being pressured to respond. What would you, as a PR professional, recommend?
So I would just say one really simple thing. We get this all the time, which has been lovely and also personally sometimes makes my eyes roll, but people say, well, we're trying to amplify our DE&I efforts. Can you guys help? And, I bite my tongue and I just say, okay, should have always been doing that, but okay, sure. Like, absolutely. Let's talk about it. But a lot of times it's sort of carrying this buzzword that almost has like no meaning to the people. And if that's the case, then we take like 5 steps back, and I'm saying, okay, I don't think you need a DE&I. I think you need to learn what DE&I is. Like, we need to start from ground zero, because this can never be a performative approach to anything. So we always, and again, we'll all laugh as PR practitioners, is like, anytime a client comes to you, my favorite example is when they say, I need a press release. And you're like, okay, well, let's take a step back. What are your goals? What are you trying to do? And most of the time they don't need a press release, right? You're like, okay, I'm happy we talked through that. You just said a buzzword you probably Googled, and you said it out loud, but that's actually not what you need at all. You need this, this, and this. And it's the same thing with DE&I. People will come to you and say, we want to do good. We want to be better. So please just start doing DE&I for us. Please. Here's a spokesperson who's Indian. Can you please promote him? Like, and we go back to like the same exact conversation. What are your goals? What are you doing internally? What are you trying to do? Are you trying to, are you talking to diverse, or your audience is diverse and you want to reach out to them better? And then that's one thing. Are you trying to promote internally diversity? Are you trying, like, what is the why, the reason? And then we go from there to put together something, but it's always about not being performative. And, there's an example of a client currently who wants to do really great DE&I stuff. Like, the intentions are amazing, but there's also a thing of wanting to do it all. So, it's X day. Can we please make a social post about it? And so, I think sometimes there's a lot of enthusiasm, but then it becomes really cluttered and awkward and almost like, I'll use one of the Gen Z words, cringe, right? It's like, why? Yeah, like, why are you posting so much about this stuff? This is bizarre, right?
Well, I'll never forget when a client came to me, they're like, we want to post a black box. And I'm like, okay, let's take a step back. Let's think about it. Why? What are you doing? And
what else are you doing? Why do you want to do that? Like, it can't be a one and done. So it's the same thing. It's just being confident and talking about that. And again, like I said in the beginning, it's personal to people. So some people might love the things you do, others will never love it. That's the way things go. It's a very personal thing. But I always say, if the intentions are really good, and the thought and strategy and care is there, most of the time you're going to like appease most people. Like, most people are going to say, like, you have a kind heart and you're trying, and I see that from you. And so, a client who wants to do it all, I always say, like, let's take a step back. And again, who are our audiences? Are we trying to, like, one is, it's actually an education. And so it's like their internal constituents within this organization are super diverse, but then it's also technology that's going out for schools where teachers are really diverse, the students are, and so they want to show that it's like, we know that our population of people who are using our product are diverse, and we want them to like come to our social pages. We want them to read our website and know that we care about this. So the intentions are so great, but that doesn't mean that you have to celebrate every single holiday, every single day, and have it be too much and cluttered. So we always start with like, so who are the populations you're serving? Is it mostly Black and Brown students? Is it is it this group? Is it this group? Like, what do they care about? And let's focus on showing and authentically showing that we also care about the things they care about, instead of doing it all. So that's like just like an example of something that we've run into. And again, it's just thinking about it. I feel just like we would any other PR plan. Like, everything we do is strategic and thoughtful. It's the same exact thing. That less is more, authentic is better. Realness is better. Tough conversations are better. And that's how we've been approaching it. And again, not everything is perfect, but I feel with like the good intentions, challenging our clients to think of things different ways, offering them our services, educating ourselves. Like, I've had to spend so much time educating myself. I understand I am one person. And my viewpoints, which we've talked about, our personal journeys, like my viewpoints are my own. So I spend a lot of time talking to others and asking their thoughts as well. I'm not just living through my own learned experience. So I try to like encourage our clients to like think of things that way as well, broadly, and to the audiences that they're serving as well.
Terrell.
My turn. Great points. So I'll try to highlight some thoughts that are different from the things that Tori shared, partly because I agree with all of that has been shared, in the sense of, I think some of the challenges that companies have faced, and to the question around missing the mark, has been this propensity or tendency to want to be able to find like the one thing that we can do. Again, this should be, I hope, a candid conversation. So it's that one thing that we can do that requires the least amount of resources, and sometimes even the least amount of extra effort, but will like keep us above board. People won't drag us on social media, and the narrative and brand are unchanged. And the reality is, I get that as a leader, why we're driven, because nobody wants to be tomorrow's headline. Nobody wants to be the trending tag on social media if it's bad news. By the same token, there is no silver bullet. There is no one and done. To me, it gets back to my earlier comment about how we have evolved as a country, right? And as corporations, we now have you know, boomers working with Gen Zers. We've got women and men and tall and short and black, white, Asian, Native American, mixed race, LGBTQIA, some who are from corporate backgrounds, some who are from working class backgrounds, all together in one space, right? So the reality is this, and it's what we've been talking about, is that there are things that happen in the world that impact or relate to some identity that each and every one of us hold. And because we are committed to diversifying our companies and we have hit some success in those areas, we now have folks on our teams who care about something that is happening right now in Malaysia that you're probably not even aware of. And so this idea of that one thing, what will work to signal that we stand in solidarity with Ukraine, won't work for that issue. And what we did to show our solidarity for Ukraine is not what we did to show our support for and our frustration with what happened with George Floyd, nor was it what we used with Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown back in the day, right? So there's no, so I think where they're missing the mark is there's this, you know, insatiable desire to have one thing that they can do. We got to stop that. It just won't work. And you don't want it anyway, because it would work so poorly for some of these issues that you'd really be on social media tomorrow. I think the second thing is, though, another place where I think there's room for improvement is companies assuming responsibility for this. Like, as the leader, I've got to have a perspective and a voice that the world will appreciate and celebrate on all things. And that's just not reasonable. So I think, you know, I care very deeply about PR as a professional, as a scholar who is committed to making sure that my research connects with the needs of the community, but also even as a senior leader. And I would encourage those who are listening and those in the PR community to think about, how do you diversify the face and voice that is speaking on behalf of the organization? I don't think it should always be the CEO. I don't think it should always, you know, I was a CAO, Chief Academic Officer. I don't think it should always be the Chief Academic Officer. There's some issues where a different person who has a different perspective, a different position, should be the one who pens the memo or communicates with the reporter or shares some video on social media. So I think breaking down this hierarchy that exists in our corporation so that we can, one, we're fostering inclusion that way, because what better way to indicate or to acknowledge, hey, your voice matters to us and it is appreciated and valued at this org, because in this moment, you're going to be our spokesperson on this issue. So I think diversifying it in that way. And then the last would be, I get it, we live in a very litigious society. So, you know, I think the other place where corporations and companies miss the mark is doing nothing, right? But realizing that inaction is actually an action. And there's a consequence for that too. And so, you know, identify leadership. That's why I love, you know, when I see folks like Tori in their position, head of DEI, Angela's role, it is important that corporations put someone in charge of this, who can hold people accountable, who can make sure that we're driving in the right direction. But that is not that person's sole job. I mean, it's not only their responsibility, the organization has to be a part of it. And I think that's where we start to really optimize the use of employee resource groups and professional learning communities, and using voice of employee surveys to always be mindful in detecting, like, where's their movement, where's there an issue that we must be responsive to, and then coming up with a strategy, not that silver bullet, but a strategy of how to address it. I think that those are the points where they missed the mark, and those are my ideas about how to then deal with that.
That's great. And I just want to piggyback on a couple of things that both you and Tori have mentioned. And I think the biggest point and the connector here is where I think companies miss the mark is in thinking that diversity, equity, and inclusion is something that you do. It is not something that you do. It is who you are or who you are not. And the very first thing you have to do is ask yourself, who are you? Are you diverse? Are you equitable? Are you inclusive? And if you have gaps in any of those areas, do you create a sense of belonging? Is there a sense of justice within your organization? And in how you communicate with your target audiences? And if there are gaps there anywhere, then you have to look at how you strategically address those gaps. And that's not with a Black square or a Juneteenth celebration. That is a strategy that addresses an entire organization, and everyone is accountable. Accountability has to be baked in for everybody, not just the Black or Hispanic or gay or Asian person that you've hired, but that the entirety of an organization has responsibility for knowing what it means and being able to have conversations about diversity and equity and inclusion, especially if you're client facing. Just one of the things that I think we have gotten to the point with Brodeur at doing very well, because hires can take a while to turn over staff or to bring new staff in, depending on how quickly you have turnover within an organization. That doesn't mean that everybody, regardless of who it is and where they sit within the organization, has some responsibility for understanding the scope of what this work means and being able to represent it when you go out and represent your company.
Great. I know we're coming up on our time, but we just have one last question. So basically, as diversity, equity, inclusion become center stage for most companies, what are some recommendations that you may have for PR professionals on how to actually have that conversation with their organization about building the capacity for DEI? How do you get that going?
Yeah, I would say, I think Angela brought up a really great point. I think around like, who are you as an organization and what do you want to stand for? I mean, I think that's a really great way to do it. I mean, I think in our case, there are clients that come to us that are already have some strategies in place. They already, it sort of already lives within their organization. And so we're able to like help them like amplify it or bring it to a new level. And that's always the dream case, right? When you have a situation like that where, wow, they just already get it. I'm working with an awesome startup where it's, he's a former engineer from Snapchat, and he convinced some funders to give him $4 million to start his own company. He's 29, he's Black, he's amazing. Obviously within his organization, like it's already a no-brainer, like DE&I is already embedded within who he is. He has stories and experiences that just have led him to where he is. As Terrell said, everyone has like their own story that's like brought them here, and his is beautiful and authentic and real. So it's like, yay, wow, this is such great work to do, because we don't even have to create a strategy. Like you are it, right? That's a dream situation. And then we can figure out ways in which to help him amplify it. If it's something where we are seeing something where, I think Terrell brought up an amazing point that we see all the time is everyone automatically assumes like the CEO will be the spokesperson. And I'm always like, no, most of the time the CEO is not the best spokesperson. So like who else within our organization? I think we do a really good job at like building a thought leadership bench and having multiple voices coming from the organization that are diverse within their job descriptions, their function within the organization, and who they are as people. I think that's like a really easy first step that people can do is like, hey, we want to, start to go after different opportunities. Again, especially as media are calling for more diverse spokespeople to comment on different topics in industries. It's a really easy way for us to even like share that information. Like the media is wanting to hear from different people. They're not wanting to hear from the one top guy in charge. So we need to help get all of these people media trained, comfortable. We need to learn about them. We need to understand them. We need to give them a voice internally, externally. It's like a very simple, easy, and I feel like we have not really run into any sort of roadblocks in that area. Like people are like, awesome, great. How could we do that? How can we implement that? So that's an easy first step, I would probably say, to start building the strategy.
I know we're at time, so the only thing I would add is, you know, that we could, to the PR professionals, you know, have the conversation, push for it to be an agenda item at meetings. You know, I think it is an important use of time to, as Tori and all of us have been sharing, you know, companies have a story, and knowing how to tell it well, in a way that is authentic and engaging and allows people to envision themselves being part of it is really important, but it doesn't come natural to everyone. So I think having time on the agenda where you're talking about the story, you're learning it, is part of the onboarding for new staff, that the PR professional is preparing talking points for people so that they can not just speak to the reporter about whatever the question is of the matter of the day, but also reviewing for people the history of contributions that the corporation has made to DEI. I would only also add, I was always really excited when the PR team prepped me, not with just talking points, but some of those success metrics, because listen, people want to know, like, hey, wow, you all have 50% more women in leadership this year than you did 5 years ago. And if that's not something that's natural to me because of my seat, I think PR professionals can play a major role in really equipping, I love that thought leadership bench for these moments.
And there's always something there. Many times companies don't even know what their story is because they have a very narrow view of what diversity or equity or inclusion mean. But so it's worth taking the time to really understand at a deeper level how you show up as an organization, or how your clients show up in the DEI space, whatever that is. And one of my biggest, and I think the most important thing that I would say to PR professionals is be okay with being uncomfortable. Sometimes the conversations are uncomfortable. They just are. It's okay. And sometimes people do get it wrong. Sometimes clients get it wrong. Sometimes we as professionals get it wrong. It's okay. When you show up authentically with the intention to do the right thing, are willing to listen, and are willing to educate yourself, stop looking for your Black or Hispanic coworkers to go do all the learning for you and then bring it back to you. Take the time to really dig in and understand some of the issues that communities are facing as it relates to diversity and equity and inclusion, and be okay with being uncomfortable. It's okay, but that's how progress happens.
That's amazing. Well, I know we're at time, but thank you guys so much for being part of the panel. I think this was really illuminating, and I think we learned a lot. So I really appreciate it.